Real Country 1430 AM and 1073 FM WRDN. Good morning. I'm Brian Winnekins, and joining us this morning is UW-Madison economics professor Stephen Deller. And recently he did a study on the housing market and was even talking about the housing market here in Western Wisconsin. We're going to talk a little bit about that this morning. And Professor Deller, thank you for joining us this morning. Well, first, I guess, tell us about your what you did to analyze the housing market in Wisconsin and in Western Wisconsin. What did y'all do?
This is something that most communities in Wisconsin are struggling with. There's a number of issues they're struggling with, everything from broadband, but housing is a common issue. And the concern really is the cost of housing is just going to be too high. So in this particular study, what we did is that we're simply looking at what's happening to the price of housing over time. And what we're seeing is that it's increasing fairly rapidly, particularly over the past year or so. And you would think with COVID and kind of the COVID recession and whatnot, that the housing market would cool off a little bit, but it actually went in the opposite direction. Prices actually jumped, and that's pretty much across the state.
And is actually because of the COVID, that's why they jumped, because there were people saying, I don't want to live in a metropolitan area. I want to live in maybe a smaller area like a Durand, or a Plum City, because I want to be away from the city and I can work from home and not have to go into the city.
That's still playing out. We're seeing some evidence of that, but there's not enough of that occurring to explain why there's this spike. I think part of it is simply a matter of supply and demand. The demand is high, and the supply, particularly of new housing coming on, particularly starter homes coming online, has just really been slow and declining. And part of it, I think, is that through the COVID period, there were all these problems with the supply chain, that the number of new houses being built just basically came to a screeching halt, whereas people still wanted to buy housing. So we have this real disconnect between the demand for housing and the supply of housing. The result, spikes in prices.
We're talking with UW-Madison Professor Stephen Deller about a recent study that he did for Wisconsin on housing and those prices of housing. Now, Professor Deller, when you looked at the state and you looked even in Western Wisconsin, we seem to our prices for housing seem to be going up faster than the rest of the state.
I think that's partially because many parts of Wisconsin are kind of late to the game, if you will. Some of the other places, like some of the suburbs around Milwaukee, Madison, the Appleton area, they've seen this rapid acceleration in housing prices over a little bit longer period. I think Western Wisconsin is just now starting to experience that increase. So on a percentage basis, it looks like Western Wisconsin is seeing prices grow faster. And I think they're catching up with the rest of the state. So it looks like it's growing faster.
What did the low interest rates, did that have a part of this as well? Okay, we have the supply chain issue, no new houses really coming online, but people still, mortgage rates at 2.5%. They've, did that play a factor into this too, to increase that demand?
Yes, it has. And it is one of the reasons there's such high demand for purchasing a house and buying houses is because mortgage rates are at a historic low level. I mean, you have to go back 50 years before you see these kind of low interest rates. And with inflation starting to rear its head, the Federal Reserve Bank has come out and said, we are going to start raising interest rates. So what's happening is that people are kind of saying, geez, if I want to take advantage of these low mortgage interest rates, I got to do it now. So when you take that on top of kind of the lull in new housing construction, it's almost like a perfect storm for a spike in housing prices. And that's what we're seeing.
Talking with Professor Stephen Deller with UW-Madison. He's a professor of agriculture and applied economics. Boy, this sounds, seeing the rise in these prices and as fast as they're going, I've seen this movie before. It's 2006. Are we headed for a 2008 part 2 coming up?
Perhaps, but no, because there's some fundamental differences between what we're seeing now and what was happening back in 2005, 2006. It's basically kind of the back leading up to the Great Recession. We saw a lot of mortgage lenders that were basically writing mortgages that they should not have been writing. There's certain rules in terms of the kind of mortgage that you're eligible. Are you eligible for a mortgage? What kind of mortgage? The terms of the mortgage. Back in the 2005, 2006, a lot of those rules were kind of thrown out. Okay, so there were a lot of people that were getting mortgages that should not have been getting mortgages. Today, we're not seeing that as much. Okay. The second thing is that's different today than back during the Great Recession is what we call the secondary market. When you take out a mortgage with the bank doesn't keep that mortgage. They sell it on the secondary market. And this is where you started to see a lot of speculation going on, a lot of really complicated financial transactions that were taking place. It kind of became the Wild West. And when the folks that were really should not have been getting mortgages started to default, it was like a house of cards and it collapsed. Okay. Today, we're not seeing folks that should not be getting mortgages, and also that secondary market. There's a set of rules and regulations that are in place that are kind of keeping it on the rails. So are we seeing a spike in housing prices? Yes. Are those housing prices going to come down? Probably, but we're not going to see the same ramification that we saw back 15 years ago.
And is part of that because this time so many people, because the interest rates were so low, that they have a 2.5% mortgage for 30 years fixed, and it's not an adjustable rate mortgage, which to me, from what I remember and all of that, that seemed to be the problem here, that when stuff started to go kind of south economically or whatever, all of a sudden my 5% mortgage that I had last year, well, now it's been cranked up to 8, and now I can't afford it.
That's exactly right. They were introducing these teaser loans, and you would come in, and for the first 1 year, you would have this really low interest rate. And at that really low interest rate, hey, maybe this mortgage makes sense for me. But then in a year, that introductory rate goes up to something much higher. And that's where people were thinking, oh, now I can't afford it. And they started to default on the mortgages.
Talking with this.
And that was one. The other one was a balloon mortgage, where you essentially get a very attractive rate. And then in 3 years, you got to pay the whole thing off. And people were getting caught up in that. Those types of things are not happening today. So we're not setting the mortgage borrowers up for failure the way we were 15 years ago.
So even if we have a quote bubble developing potentially, and prices go down because we don't have things like that, we have fixed mortgages, we don't have the adjustable rate ones that are based off the prime rate and all that, they go up, then we don't have these balloon payments and all of that. While someone who purchased a house here in the last couple of years and they paid a lot more, and the value of that goes down, they're still going to be able to at least continue to pay the mortgage, because that's not going to change. That price of that mortgage every month isn't going to change.
That's correct. There still are adjustable rate mortgages, but I think the mortgage lenders are being a little, they're doing their due diligence much better now than they were 15 years ago. If the market corrects itself too much and you find that people start to become what's called underwater, they owe more on the mortgage than what the house is worth, then it's going to come up to the banks and how the banks want to handle that. If you have stable income and you're making payments, things are probably going to just continue to write out fine. But that could be a potential red flag in the future. But I think that there will be some downside risk for some folks, but I think from an overall economy perspective, I think we're going to be okay.
And for those still looking, do they? It's got to be really hard. I've had this conversation before. Do you try and do something now because interest rates are low? And I turn around and say, yeah, but remember, the house that is on the market that we are interested in, it's not really, we're paying a third more for it. So maybe we should wait for the price, lower principal, if I have a lower principal, then I'm not going to have as much interest. But the interest rate's higher. So is it 6 of one and half a dozen of the other? I mean, how do people navigate this?
You have to think about your own personal situation. You have to think about how stable your employment is. You have to think about potential growth in your income. And you have to think about how long are you thinking about being in that house. If you are thinking that my employment is stable, I have really good opportunities to see my income grow, and I plan on being in this house for at least 20 years, then maybe now's the time to buy. But if you answer no to any of those, then the timing may not be right. You may want to delay a little bit and see what happens over the next couple of years.
Professor Deller, you looked at housing prices. Did you look at rents?
Oh, the rental market is even worse. Because what's happening is that, and this is particularly true in outside of the major cities, outside of the Madisons, outside of the Milwaukees, is that as the housing market, the buy a home market is tighter and tighter and tighter, folks are going into the rental markets. And for a lot of communities don't want to see rental property developed. There's this notion in a lot of communities that when we get new housing development, it's a pretty little Cape Cod on a quarter-acre lot with a white picket fence. That's what we want, okay? But what the community really needs is an apartment complex. A lot of communities don't want that kind of development. So we're seeing real constraints on the supply. So what happens then is rental prices go through the roof. And we're seeing that now. So a lot of communities, they're coming at it as, they're coming at the housing issue as two parts. One is it's simply too expensive, particularly in the starter home market, or it's really inferior housing. And that inferior housing is starting to cost more and more and more to rent. So they're trying to figure out, a lot of communities are trying to figure out how do we address this issue. And during the pandemic, because of supply chain issues, they haven't really been able to address it. So I mean, and you have developers that are coming out and looking at saying, look, I could build 4 starter homes and make a certain amount of profit, or I could build 1 big home and make more profit. If I'm that contractor, what am I going to do? I'm going to build that bigger home because I can make more money. Now with the supply chain problems, the cost of building materials is just going through the roof. So even if a developer said, no, I want to build 4 starter homes, they can't make the math work. So they're not doing anything. They're not building. And that's where that supply, that gap in supply and demand happens.
As you look in your crystal ball, and I realize all economists, economic professors included, Well, on the one hand, and then we'll have on the other hand. So I understand that. What's the crystal ball say? When does this cycle break? When does the log jam finally break?
If I knew the answer to that, I'd be driving a brand new Ferrari. Honestly, I think we're looking at about 2 years. I think that the upward pressure on housing prices is slowing down a little bit. They're still going up, but not at the rate that it had been. And I think that's because interest rates are picking up a little bit. I think that as the supply chain problems start to work their way through, I think we'll start to see more housing being built. And I think that some of that pressure is going to start alleviating itself over the next couple of years.
Now, maybe this doesn't really factor in, but I'm going to throw this out there. Again, being the history nut I am, the situation in Ukraine. Let's say tomorrow that all ends. That country needs to be rebuilt. Is that going to now suddenly draw all of the construction materials, all that stuff that we might need? Is that going to draw that away from there? Is that going to cause more demand for stuff like lumber and steel and concrete and all? Because we've seen all the pictures.
It could. It won't help. It won't help because there will be, if it all ends tomorrow, I think the amount of humanitarian aid flowing into Ukraine in an attempt to rebuild it will be significant. So I think in things like steel, I think you'll see a tremendous copper for copper wires. There's going to be a huge demand for that type of building material stuff in your rebuild when you're rebuilding Ukraine. We see it sometimes. We sometimes call it the drywall effect. And this is when in the US, when we have a natural disaster like a hurricane, there's this sudden surge in rebuilding, and you'll see the price of drywall shoot up. And it's because there's this sudden surge in demand for that kind of material to rebuild areas that have been devastated by natural disasters like a hurricane. We're seeing it in increasingly in the price of shingles because the amount of wind damage that's occurring with extreme weather that we're experiencing more of, the price of shingles have gone up. Is because the demand is just really high, and we don't have the capacity to increase the supply, at least in the short term.
Sure. All right. That is Professor Stephen Deller with UW Madison. He's a professor of agriculture and applied economics. You're listening to WRDN.